Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We have a terrific webinar. Every single topic regarding cybersecurity is compelling, and this one is no exception. There's just so many things to talk about. We could not fit them all, certainly, in one webinar or even a dozen webinars. But anyway, here we are today. We have ASMGi and Arctic Wolf. We're going to talk about next-gen cybersecurity through CMMC. I just want to make note, if you have a question today, please jump right in and hit the chat box, hit the Q&A box, raise your hand if you want to chat, or if you want to talk, and we'll unmute you. And it is my privilege now to introduce Steve Racing, President and CEO of ASMGi. Take it away, Steve.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks everybody for sharing your time with us today. Paul already mentioned we have a great topic today, and all cybersecurity topics are great and relevant for sure. But next gen cybersecurity through CMMC. So we are putting a webinar series together to talk about compliance in general, and the convergence between compliance and security is it gets a little gray and fuzzy in there anyway. So today we're going to focus on CMMC though, and it's a great topic, and hopefully we can answer some questions for folks, and this can be really useful to the audience. So please, as Paul mentioned, our intention is to keep this real interactive. So if you have questions, just raise your hand or enter the question in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to it as soon as possible. So joining me today is Brad Hanley, systems engineer from Arctic Wolf. Brad, welcome, and thanks for joining us today, and really excited to have you here.
Yeah, thanks, Steve and Paul and the entire ASMGi team for having me. I'm excited to be a part of this.
Yep. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself, Brad, and a little bit about your role at Arctic Wolf?
So yeah, I've been around IT security or information security for a little over 10 years. Had a heavy focus on regulations and frameworks.
Yep.
I tend to really nerd out on that sort of stuff. So I play a role at Arctic Wolf as kind of on a pre-sales engineering side, but I also play kind of a dual role of being a bit of a subject matter expert when it comes to all things regulatory. So a lot of the teams, whether they're the security teams or the sales teams, come to me with any sort of questions that they might be facing.
So here's your first question. Is nerd out a technical term? Are we going to talk about that today? Is there a definition?
Super technical.
Yeah. Okay. Now you wrote a white paper or a guide on CMMC specifically for Arctic Wolf, correct? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's correct. So we obviously CMMC is a pretty big thing, and a lot of companies have those requirements coming down the pipeline. So we wanted to make sure that we were able to understand how our services help meet those requirements.
Yeah.
So what I did is I ran through all of the different requirements that are found within the CMMC levels 1 through 5. Technically speaking, 1 through 3 is all that's solidified. So I ran through and I created a white paper off it that basically showed how much we're able to help fulfill the requirements found within CMMC to help our customers out.
Awesome. Well, I'm happy to have you here, and we'll lean on your expertise often. I think, and like I said earlier, I hope that this is really helpful to the audience, and we'll try to keep it as interactive as possible. So basically today, then we're going to go through some background on CMMC and what it is, who it applies to, and those kind of things. There are a couple words. We live in a world of acronyms, right? Alphabet soup. So we're going to use some of those regularly, and we'll take some time to really define those, and then just break down the structure of CMMC so we can see how it's put together and how applicability aligns with companies and those kind of things. And then we'll do exactly what you talked about. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about, okay, how can we help, right? This is, it can be daunting when a new compliance requirement comes down the pipe like this. So, and then we'll spend a little bit of time with some announcements and those kind of things. So we'll jump right in. And I think from a background standpoint, the defense industry base of contractors, ultimately, right? They've been trying to figure out, the government has been trying to figure out how to increase security posture for a long time. And, you know, I'll say from a cyber incident standpoint, it's just mind-boggling. It feels like we're losing the battle in a lot of different ways, right? And so the government basically said, hey, if you're going to do business with the government, then you got to meet these requirements, right? So securing this defense industry base of contractors has been a priority for quite some time. But this slide really resonated because a lot of people who do business with the government don't really comply with the regulations that are already out there, right? So here comes the new one. Do you want to speak to this at all, or?
Yeah, so really what I was kind of driving towards with this slide is DFARS regulation 7012 is essentially telling everybody in the defense industry base, so whether you're a prime or a sub on a federal contract with the DoD, that you had to self-attest to your adherence to, it's called NIST Special Publication 800-171. So it's, the goal of that is to protect CUI and FCI, which we'll talk about in a second. So it's historically has been self-attestation, right? So we're relying on organizations to say that they're doing fulfilling the laws or the rules around the DFARS policies. And this was actually a study done by a third-party company that reached out to a large amount of within the defense industry base, and 62% of them self-identified as not complying with those regulations.
Yeah.
So it's really kind of laying that groundwork of like, this is a really big problem.
Yep. But probably not as big a problem is if 100% of people self-attested to complying and none of them did, right? But that happens too, right? When it's amazing when somebody gets a questionnaire, the temptation to say yes when you really mean no. That's
and the DoD knows about that. They know that a lot of people are filling out these self-attestations, saying that they're meeting the requirements when they're not actually meeting them.
We're going to talk a little bit about some of the major changes and the differences, but I think this is a big one, right? It's an auditable compliance requirement, right? And it'll take some time to get there, most likely, but there will be certified auditors that you'll be required to pass an audit in order to bid on contracts. And I think that's a big difference. I wanted to, not a whole lot of case studies. I mean, there are countless case studies and we could have gone anywhere with this, but I thought this was a good example of what could happen because it's a smaller subcontractor basically, right? But maybe you can just explain this a little bit and then we can dig in on the example.
Yeah, so as you laid out, they're a smaller subcontractor. I don't remember exactly what they do. They have something to do with manufacturing. So they were hit with a form of ransomware. And the group that hit them, basically what they do is they steal your information and then they lock down your machines. They encrypt everything so you can no longer access the data. And then they tell you essentially, pay this ransom, or not only are we not going to allow you to get your data back, we're going to release it out to the general public. And being that they had some pretty sensitive information, as you can see on here, they had billing information. They did work with large companies that are big in the defense industry base, Lockheed, Boeing, SpaceX, Tesla. And they basically said, hey, we're going to release out this data to the general public if you don't pay the ransom. And in fact, they had already started to release some of that data when I had put this slide together. And you can see there's a lot of sensitive information in there.
Yep. I think it's a good example because just metaphorically, and this is a real story. I had they were a maintenance shop, right? But they repaired jet engines, right? And the owner of the company said to me, nobody really cares about us or our data or that kind of thing. And I said, yeah, but your number one customer is GE, people care about GE, right? So they'll use you to get to them. And I think that's a lot of what's happening here. This company was probably not feeling real good about having this data released when all of this sensitive information with the companies that they do business with. So I mean, damages, just even from a damage standpoint, if you think about the impact to a company of this type of data breach, right? Those customers are gone. They're not coming back, right?
And if you think of it from like a national security standpoint, this could be even worse. And that's something that I think that a lot of the industry as a whole struggles with is, and I think a good example of this is looking at what happened during Stuxnet. If anybody's familiar, there was a Siemens controller, so like a small little device that was compromised and essentially was able to blow up, do a nuclear meltdown of some nuclear iron rods for that the Iranians had. So it's a small part can lead to really big consequences.
Right.
So thinking that, you know, the stuff that we're making doesn't matter isn't necessarily accurate, because that information can definitely be used to as a you know, maybe it's a step into something larger, or it's the exact attack methodology that's going to be gone after.
Yep. Yeah. And the other thing that jumped out at me from this example is this is a subcontractor. It's not even the direct contractor, right? So and I just want to make sure everybody understands that applicability for the CMMC, which is the Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification, right? So but applicability, you may not do business directly with the government, but if you're a subcontractor to a company that does business with the government, then it applies. And I just want to make sure everybody understands that, because the applicability is broader than just people who want to bid on contracts. That's so it's important that everybody really understands that. So
yeah,
let's talk a little bit about what CMC is and some background on it in general. So I wanted to just go through. It's a security. It stands for the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. But one of the big factors in this is it is an actual certification, right? So that implies that somebody is going to audit you, and that you have to comply with a certain set of controls. Correct? So not a whole lot to say about it other than that, really, from a what is it standpoint. But I think it is a very important aspect of it, is moving from this self-attestation, somebody sending you a questionnaire or asking you if you do something, to actually being audited on it. So I think that's a very important distinction and important step. And this, you mentioned a couple of these terms earlier, Brad, but I wanted to talk about definitions a little bit, because the whole CMMC is based on protecting federal data, federal information. And the two terms that you used earlier, FCI and CUI, I think it's important that you understand what is encompassed within them, to figure out if you have that data or not, and make sure that you have the controls in place to protect it. So I thought it was worthy to do this. Do you have any thoughts or elaboration on the?
Yeah, so I think CUI is oftenly the most thought about aspect of CMMC,
Mhm.
and FCI, Federal Contract Information, is the most forgotten. So in level 1, that's where you have access to federal contract information. That can be something as benign as measurements to a bolt that are unique for DoD usage, right? So it's not what's called COTS, custom off-the-shelf goods or something like that. So it's something that's uniquely built for the federal government. So having sending an email that has the dimensions of this bolt, that's considered to be FCI information.
Yep.
And then controlled unclassified information is generally speaking a more sensitive amount of data. This could be maybe a schematic of some sort, a blueprint, if you will, of, whatever entity that thing that is being created. And there are larger requirements around those. So if you have access to CUI, controlled unclassified information, that is where level 3 comes into play.
Yep. Yep. Awesome. And we'll go through the structure shortly, but just kind of going down this definition path, I thought it was worth talking about the model in general from a definition standpoint. It's really, there are some other federal regulations in place. So it's important to note that, the government is not just throwing out everything that they've ever thought about, but they're trying to leverage that and incorporate it in an auditable mechanism, right? In a framework that also requires an audit. But some of the other things you've talked about, like the FAR, or you've talked about DFARS. The FAR is the Federal Acquisition Regulation. But there are a couple of different standards, like, NIST, Special Publication 800-171, and those kind of things. All of those controls are incorporated by virtue of this. And then the big differentiator, I think, just being that it's an auditor is going to come in and make sure that they're in place and that you're doing things right. All right. Anything else from a definition standpoint?
Yeah, I would add in, so 800-171 was the previously held to requirement of self-attestation. And you're spot on, Steve, where if you look at the new CMMC framework, and we'll go through how there's different levels. If you look at the first 3 levels, you actually have all of 800-171 plus a few additional CMMC specific ones. So there is definitely a layer of consistency there.
Yep. Awesome. So here, I thought we'd spend a few minutes talking about the structure of CMMC and how it's put together, right? So I think, to me, the key here is that it's a maturity model. And so there's a pretty common structure for maturity models that, you have a model, and then there are some domains that break controls out. It's a categorization tool, right? So there's some categories or domains, and within a domain, there might be some processes, but there are clearly some capabilities that are required to comply with a specific domain. And in order for the capabilities to work, then there are practices. So if we step down through a hierarchy of the way the CMMC is structured, I think this captures the essence of what a maturity model looks like, but specifically what CMMC in this case does. Anything that you would add to that, Brad?
No, I don't think so. I think I think this is pretty self-explanatory. I mean, if you see things like AU.4. I'm making this up, 012, the AU represents the domain, right? And then the 4 represents the level, and then the rest is.
And we'll go through some of that so that you can see some of those things. But just again, from a structural standpoint, if you look at how CMMC is kind of sliced and diced, right? There are various different levels. You mentioned that already, Brad. So to kind of tap into that. And what I like about this perspective is that at each level, it's cumulative, right? So every, they fold up into the subsequent level, right? So level 2 includes all of level 1 plus some additional things. Level 3 includes all of 2 and 1 plus some additional things. Level 4 includes all of 1, 2, and 3 plus some additional things. And I think it's important to understand that from a practices standpoint, but also just the increasing level of, as you move up the maturity level. I mean, this isn't rocket science. You would imagine that it would be more stringent and the requirements would be tougher as you increase the maturity level. So I don't think if there's anything really surprising here, but I thought it was relevant just to map to the different levels. And so an end user company has to decide what level is applicable to them, right? And then, it's already defined what controls need to be put in place for each level. Correct?
Yeah, and the levels will actually be on the prime's contract. So as your prime, or if you are a prime, it will actually be written into the contract with the DoD. what level it needs to be required
Yep.
for that specific contract to be awarded.
Yep. So I think what you hit on is a very important legal aspect. It's intended to be written into the contract, right? So it is a legal commitment, a contractual commitment to achieve this level of maturity and have these controls in place.
Yeah, and actually to be awarded the contract now, you have to get audited by a third party that is considered to be, it's a C3 PAO.
Yeah.
And they have to attest to saying, yes, we went through an audit. Yes, they meet the requirements found within this level.
Yeah.
And then you can apply for the actual.
Yeah. So again, this is it's a different perspective on really the same thing. As you increase the levels, they all fold into each other, and obviously your maturity goes up. If you're a level 5, then theoretically you're reducing the risk of advanced persistent threats and those kind of things, right? Level 1 doesn't deal with that, quite honestly, but this is basically the levels and associated the focus area of each level. And I just want to toggle through this really quick. So I thought this perspective was really cool because it quantifies the number of practices or specific things, I'll say, that you need to do at each level. So if you look across each domain, then it quantifies in level 1, level 2, level 3, 4, 5, whatever, total of 26 practices, and they apply in this proportion. There's total of 2 practices in that category and those kind of things. So again, it's just a different perspective on the same thing, but it does start to quantify the number of practices in each domain and at each level as you do that. So it's an important distinction, and you talked about this a second ago, and I think it's relevant and critical to understand that this is not a whimsical approach to ask people if they have controls in place, right? They're intending to audit as well and certify governing bodies that are, certified auditors, basically. So know what to look for and those kind of things. Just any thoughts in general on this, Brad?
Yeah. So what is really interesting about this is the DoD knew going into this that they wanted to have this audited by third parties. So they needed to identify a way to essentially train and certify these third parties to become auditors. So they actually went into actual contractual relationship with a nonprofit organization called the Cmmc accreditation body. So the Cmmc accreditation body is contracted with the DoD to actually go through and look at these information security companies and accredit that they're able to do these assessments.
Yeah.
And there's 2 really important distinctions. So, and this is oftentimes confused. So C3 PAOs, or certified third-party assessor organizations, they're the ones that are doing the actual certifications of people in the defense industry base, or the companies in the defense industry base. So they're the ones that you need to actually apply for a contract to be able to get a contract, And then RPOs, registered provider organizations, those are organizations that can consult to and give you what are called gap analyses. So basically looking at what you've got implemented and saying, yes, you should be able to pass this audit, or no, you're not going to be able to.
Right.
Here's how to get there, right?
Right.
And there's some very distinct regulations in place of what they can and cannot do. So RPOs, they're allowed to sell you services. There's no issues with that. C3 PAOs, they're not allowed to do anything outside of that actual audit. So there are some very stern guidelines that are followed around that.
Yeah, that's a great explanation. So, and I would call the RPO model we call it a readiness assessment, right? So you can help evaluate if a company has got the controls in place. We did have a question come in that I can't remember if we have an answer baked into the presentation. So I want to make sure we address this. How long does a certification last or extend to?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I believe it is in the deck, and I believe what they're at right now is it's going to be 3 years. The certification is going to be good for 3 years.
Yep.
That's the latest information that we have.
Yep.
And I
it
should
is worth
preface all
noting.
this, I'm not a registered provider or anything like that.
Yeah. It's worth noting that the framework or the model, there's a write-up, and we have a resources slide in here, so people can go and download this and just read about the framework in general and better understand what it is and applicability and those kind of things. But it just went out, it went out for review to the industry, right? So there's I think this is the other interesting part about the creation of this, is it's not being done in a vacuum, right? So it's being reviewed by industry experts and those kind of things, and people have an opportunity to give feedback on it, right? So there are some things that are not yet determined or decided, but I think 3 years is the current time frame for certification. So if you get a certification today, it'll be good for 3 years. That's the gist of that. This is a great opportunity we could spend a lot of time talking about these things. So we'll go through them a little bit, but I thought it was relevant, and it's a great slide, Brad, to really talk about some of the things that have changed from the old way of doing business with the government to the new way of doing business with the government. And so we'll just start, and I'm just going to bounce these off you, and it'll be like a little bit like speed dating, right? I'm going to try to trip you up too. That's so we'll just start up in the upper left-hand corner, and I'm just going to fire through these real quickly, and you can say anything that comes to your mind. How about that?
Love it.
Third-party audits.
Yeah, so it's a big change. We've talked about it used to be self-assessments. Now you have to get audited by a third party. So it's big change.
Yep. Trickle down to subs.
We talked about that at the beginning as well. So it doesn't matter anymore if you're just a sub under a prime, or maybe you're a few layers down. If you're contributing to fulfilling the contract, these requirements come down to you.
Yep. And I do want to mention that, part of this series that we're talking about compliance, third-party risk is a huge thing. And our next webinar is about third-party risk. And I have a slide to talk about that a little bit, but this is a very important aspect of this framework, that it doesn't just apply to prime contractors, right? So the government isn't saying, you person, if you want to bid on our contract, you have to meet these compliance requirements. They're telling everybody that's in that supply chain, if you will. And supply chain diversity and resilience is a very, very hot topic right now. And, we have a lot of very public breaches that we could reference as cases of that. But I think that's an important aspect. So pass or fail.
Yeah, so previously you could, and this will touch on the next one, previously you could do a plan of action, or POAMs. And basically, so if you didn't fulfill all of the requirements within 800.171, you could say, I have a plan to get them, the controls that are not implemented, yeah. And that would satisfy the requirements. Now it's literally either you're going to pass the audit at the level that you're required to, or you're not. So what's really interesting about this is you can be one control away from level 3, and that defaults you to level 2.
Yeah.
If the control is found within level 2. If the control is found within level 1, you haven't even met level 1 requirements yet.
Yep. So talk about POAMs a little bit more. And I think the point you made is really relevant and something that we want to emphasize.
It's maybe the most asked about thing within the new regulations. Of historically, I could say this is how I plan on meeting the requirements. POAMs are no longer a thing, unfortunately. So it does kind of come back to that. Either you meet the requirements today when the audit is done, and you can show that it's institutionalized, right? That's a big change, meaning that it has to be normal practicing procedures for your organization, or you're going to fail. And it's unfortunately as simple as that. It's very black or white.
Yeah. And I think that's we could say that hundreds of times, but I think that's a relevant point that needs to be made. This is an audit, and you need to put a control in place, and then it's red and green from there. You're either doing it or you're not doing it. That's and I think there's a very important distinction to make. HIPAA, just to kind of tie this to some other attempts we've made to regulate industries, right? So HIPAA comes along, and one of the first things that we heard a lot was HIPAA doesn't have any teeth. There are no auditors. We get points for trying hard, all of those things, right? Which is basically the POAM model, right? You can say, I don't have this in place today, but we're working on it, and we'll have it in place at a certain time, and this kind of thing. This CMMC is not that way. It is an audit, and it's either a yes or a no, period, pass or a fail. And I think that's important to understand that. So built-in cost for added expenses.
Yeah, so this is an important thing that Katie Arrington, she's essentially the person at the DoD that is really heading up CMMC. She has publicly stated that the DoD is expecting that their contractors and their subcontractors are going to incur additional costs to meeting these requirements. So they're expecting a jump in what the actual costs are going to be for procurement from the government side. So they are expecting these costs to be rolled into a lot of those proposals.
Yep. So this is a side effect of COVID and working from home, but my kids are right outside my office door and they're playing a game and they're being pretty loud. So I'm going to try to work the mute, but it's very possible that you'll see my mouth moving and not hear any sound. So I'll do the best I can. Let's keep moving on these maturity based.
Yeah, so we kind of talked a lot about this, how there's levels 1 through 5. I'll mention again, 4 and 5 are undefined. A majority of the defense industry base is going to fall under levels 3 and below. They do suspect that the most will be on level 1. 2 is a gap level, if you will. It's a building upon level, kind of going above and beyond. So this entire framework is based around maturity, meaning that you don't have to have level 5 right out of the gate. Historically speaking, frameworks and regulations have been horrible about this, where a small 5-person company would have the same requirements as a 1,000-person organization. That's no longer the case. It's really about what sort of access do you have, like what sort of sensitivity do you have of data do you have, and that's where the maturity model comes into play. So this I think is really a good thing for the industry.
Yep. So just from an implementation standpoint, Brad, start at 1, get all those controls done, move to 2, get all those controls done, move to 3. I mean, I just want to get a sense for how would an organization go about meeting this compliance requirement?
Yeah, so I would recommend to go through a gap assessment as the start, whether that's done in-house, if you have a security person in-house, or hiring on a company to come in and do a gap assessment to actually figure out kind of where am I at today. That way you can start to build out a plan of here's when I need to be compliant, and here's my path to get there.
Nice. Okay, part of the contract.
Yeah, so this is again another one that we've touched on previously that I think is really important. The level of CMMC that has to be implemented is part of the actual contract that would be awarded. So in order to even submit a proposal, you have to be certified into that specific level for that contract. So very important.
Excellent. And certifications are valid for 3 years. So there's your answer.
Self-explanatory on that one.
Yeah. Yep. This is great. And I think a lot of things, that this slide highlights are very important to understand about this framework. So thanks for putting that together. I want to shift gears a little bit to, Okay, so hopefully we all have an understanding about CMMC and what it is. How do we help and how do we help meet these requirements? So I want to pull up some information, and I'll make a few key points about this afterwards, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit, Brad, on just what we're looking at and how it aligns with what we've talked about so far.
Yeah, so this is part of that white paper that we had talked about at the very beginning, that I had done a mapping of our services. So what a mapping is looking at what the policies are, like what's in CMMC, the actual controls. And then I looked at how our services help meet some of those controls, or play a role in meeting the control. So I went through all of them, and essentially what I did is I broke each of these down by their own individual domains. So you can see system information and integrity all the way down to access control. And then I put in the percentage of, these are controls that we touch in for all of the controls found within that specific domain. So as you can see here, it's pretty overwhelming that we help out a ton within the domains.
Yep. Yep. And then, just one of the things that I would point out. So when we combine Arctic Wolf with ASMGi, we're putting this program together called MDR MSOC Plus, and it includes, a lot of things in addition to the base, right? So these numbers are going to go up, and we'll dig into this a little bit later when we talk about the specific program itself. But I want to make that point because first of all, there isn't just one solution that can meet all these different control requirements and those kind of things, right? But this is a phenomenal, way to meet your compliance requirements, is to do a lot of these things. And it would be impossible to go through every single control in a webinar and have a conversation about it. But we can do this with the audience. If you want to, ask specific questions or drill in on a specific set of controls or domains, or find out where you're at, we can definitely do those things. So this is a percentage of controls that meet each of these domains. It's a phenomenal head start, I'll say, in being compliant. So what about this slide? You want to talk about it a little bit, Brad?
Yeah, so in each of the levels, there's their own controls, right? And Steve was talking about this earlier, how each level builds off of the previous. So in level 1, you have 17 controls. In level 2, you add on additional controls on top of the 17 to equal 72 controls. I'm not good at math, so I'm not going to do it on the whim here. But as you can see, it's all about building up. Levels 4 and 5 are still up in the air. They're still being worked on, so there's nothing official. I also suspect that we don't have anybody on the webinar today that is going to need to have levels 4 and 5. So really what I did is I put in here the individual levels and where Arctic Wolf helps meet them. And like Steve was saying earlier, there's going to be a lot that the ASMGi team is going to be doing on top of what we're already doing on the Arctic Wolf side in this partnership that we have together to help you meet a lot of these additional controls that we might not be touching on.
I'm trying to work my mute button, and anyway, it's a great slide. But I think what I take out of this is, at each level, the number that's represented in the dark orange is the total number of controls for that level. And I think it's worth pointing out, and you mentioned this already, Brad, but it's relevant and worth pointing out and reiterating. It's a maturity model, right? So nobody's going to come in day one and achieve perfection, right? This is something to aspire to and to work towards, and being somewhere on that continuum from a maturity level, it's important from a gap assessment standpoint to say, here's where we are currently and here's where we need to be. And then, everything in between is the gap, quite honestly, right? And so you have to build a roadmap and prioritize those initiatives and those kind of things. But if you do that from the perspective of lowering your risk, that's the way priority. So I get compliance is yes or no, pass or fail. you have to do it, have to versus want to, and all those things. But prioritization should be on, the first things you should do are the things that lower your risk the most, and get some perspective, some outside perspective on that, right? I think it's valuable. It's valuable to do that. So I want to talk a little bit about the solution in general, because I think it matters, and this is, in the context of how do we help, right? So let's get in the weeds a little bit on the MDR MSOC Plus program and what it basically boils down to, and we'll dissect it a little bit. But at the end of the day, MDR MSOC Plus is everything that Arctic Wolf brings to the table and then some, right? And that's what the plus is about, right? It's more than just that. So let's talk about those things a little bit. I wanted to define risk in general. So this is outside of the CMMC, but this is something that all risk professionals should be very intimately and acutely aware of, right? But risk equals likelihood times impact. It always equals that, right? So if you look at, I'm not a math major either, quite honestly, but if the equation, the math part of this is pretty straightforward, right? Anything times zero is zero. So the risk is zero if either the likelihood or the impact is zero. So if we can drive towards that, if we can lower the likelihood of something bad happening or lower the impact, then the risk is going to go down. And so I thought it was important to just start with, so how do we do that, right? So how do we affect the likelihood of an incident happening? And one of the ways that we do this in the MDR MSOC Plus world is by remediating vulnerabilities. So just, not to get heavy on the statistics, but 99% of attacks are from known vulnerabilities. That's a huge, huge number. If you remediate the known vulnerabilities, you take 99% of the attack surface away. It's phenomenal when you think about that. But identifying vulnerabilities continuously and across all modes, this is another way that we can help drive down the likelihood, right? So this is one of the things I get so geeked up about this partnership, and we love the approach that Arctic Wolf takes, and put a lot of effort into picking a partner that that was holistic and total in this approach. But even from a vulnerability assessment standpoint, I mean, Arctic Wolf is looking at everything, right? Not just devices that you put an agent on, the host-based vulnerability scans, but also the network, right? Putting appliance in place and looking at network traffic and trying to identify anomalies that way. Looking from the outside in, right? This is what an attacker would see, and doing external vulnerability assessments and scans and those kind of things. So there's a very good chance that, well, first of all, to remediate anything, you have to first know that it exists, right? So finding out that it exists is a critical part of that. And I feel like Arctic Wolf does a great job of doing that. And I think that this is an opportunity for us to drive down the likelihood towards or zero, right? Either to equal zero or be towards zero. And impact, what I like to talk about is identifying intrusions quickly. So if anybody's familiar with the Ponemon Institute or the security report that IBM and the Ponemon Institute work on together, 206 days, that's the average, what we call dwell time, right? The average time if somebody compromises your network, the average time they're there before they're detected, 206 days. That's it's mind-boggling when you think about those statistics that way, right? If I was a bad guy and I had 206 days, I'm pretty sure I could figure out how to cause harm, right? We're detecting incidents with Arctic Wolf being the eyes on glass, detecting incidents in minutes. It's huge. Early detection is a huge way to drive down the impact. The identification of configure issues in the cloud, right? So again, from a vulnerability management standpoint, we'll look at if people are moving to Azure or AWS or Google Cloud, we can look at any one of those and identify configuration issues. So if somebody leaves an RDP port open or does some configuration error or just spins up a VM for whatever reason, it doesn't tell anybody, right? It doesn't put the gold standard configuration in place. We're going to know about it, right? We're going to identify those things and raise a flag and tell people about that. So I think that's huge. Containment of the incident. So what I mean by this is, like, if I'm on my laptop and I click on a link in spam and I download software to my laptop, we have the ability to automatically remove my laptop from network traffic, right? So that badness can't propagate to other laptops or to file servers, or, dig around and root around and find the crown jewels and various things. And then the other thing that we do to lower the impact is to practice, rehearse, have a structured approach to incident response, right? So if something bad happens, one of the ways to minimize the impact is to practice. You don't want the first time you've ever executed an incident response plan to be when you have an incident, right? Because people are not in their right mind probably then anyway. They're just trying to fight the fire at hand and get back in operation. So if you practice it, there's just no doubt in my mind that you'll be better at execution of that. So anything, Brad, that you would elaborate or add to this portion?
I have to say that the InfoSec geek in me is really, I love this slide. I think this slide is phenomenal. It's a really important concept. If there's one thing that you can take away, I hope it's this equation, because you can really do a lot with the likelihood times impact equation to really understand where prioritizations should lie. This is like Steve was saying, this is something that InfoSec people have been using for years to identify what risk is. I remember when I first got over to Arctic Wolf 3 years ago, I taught some of our junior salespeople this equation, and I brought up a slide. During that time, there was an event where somebody's Alexa device, their little Echo, had sent a recording of a conversation to a random contact in that person's contacts. Yeah. And it happened once. It was documented, which is great, but there was no other known events of that happening. So it seemed to be kind of a weird freak thing that had happened. There was no signs of like some third party manipulating anything or any sort of things like that. So I use that to say that, like, is a recording in your home, does that have a high impact? Of course, you could be talking about something very sensitive, right? So it could have a really high impact. So if you look at 0 to 10 and you put that at a 10, then you have to look at the likelihood. And this hit every major news outlet out there was talking about this when this happened. And every time I saw it, it really frustrated me because of the fact that if you look at the likelihood, there was one documented case of this happening, and it didn't seem to be a systemic issue. It didn't seem to be an issue where there was a threat actor doing anything devious. It just seemed to be a weird freak thing. So by any stretch of your imagination, the likelihood of that was 0 at that time. I haven't reassessed kind of what that risk is today, but 0 times 10, like Steve was saying, you're better at math than I am. That's 0 every time. So 0 risk. So it's a really a good way to kind of question things that are out there. I use this equation outside of my information security life in my personal life as well. So this is one of the ones that I'm very passionate about.
Yep. Awesome. Yep. That's a good explanation. So, and we talk about this equation a lot when we, Windows 2003, there are a lot of companies who are still running Windows 2003, believe it or not, right? Even though it's not supported. But if it's air gapped, if the vulnerability exists, there's no question. But if it's not exploitable, then it's the likelihood of something bad happening is 0 or close to 0, right? That's so it's important to make a distinction between those things. I'm not going to spend any time on this, but we have an internal brand at ASMGi called One Team, and I want to get to and spend a little bit of time, save some time for questions and spend a little bit of time on the thing. But I just wanted to mention, philosophically, what we're trying to accomplish is really a total solution, right? And so Arctic Wolf is a huge component of that, but it's a part of it. and a total solution really, in our opinion, includes the program plus the technology plus the operations. And that means, when I talk about operations, I mean, like somebody has to show up to work tomorrow and actually do this, right? And that's a part, like when people do total cost analysis and all of these things, right? The terminology has been around for a long time, but still there are a lot of components that get left out from a cost standpoint, and operations is one of those places, and the program is one of those places. So I just wanted to mention that, and it'll be included if anybody wants to take a look afterwards. But I thought it was relevant to just talk about MDR MSOC Plus and what's included and what the total solution really looks like. And so I try to color code things just to differentiate between what Arctic Wolf does and what ASMGi does, because we get asked this all the time, right? But it's really a solution. It's not about who does what. It's just about getting the outcome or the result that you achieve. But the security operations centers, this is part that Arctic Wolf has staffed. And then we play a huge role, though, in evaluating and assessing the data that comes from, like, the Security Operations Center is looking for indicators of compromise that get tripped. When something gets escalated or something gets tripped, then there's the question about, is this a real problem or is this not a problem? And those kind of things. So this is something that Arctic Wolf does and is part of that thing, their solution. The MDR part, and this is an Arctic Wolf solution, quite honestly. And I don't say this like an us and a them. I'm trying to differentiate between how the pieces are put together to achieve a total solution. But managed detect and response is, by definition is a little reactive in nature. And it's, if somebody compromises your network, detecting that they're there and then saying something about it, right? And so the metaphor I use all the time is, if you're in a museum, right, and there's the crown jewels are sitting under this case in the middle of the floor, there's infrared lights shining all over the place that will trip an alarm. Like if you just try to walk to the crown jewels and take it, you'll set off an alarm, right? So in the movies, you see a lot of the bad guys, they blow dust on the infrared lights so you could see them, and then they contort their bodies to try to get to the thing, right? So in any event, but that's really what MDR is all about, is watching the store all of the time. And if somebody trips an indicator of compromise, and again, the metaphor in that is, if you've got that beam of light showing, the bad guys are going to make mistakes, right? And so what's important is that somebody's looking for that and says, hey, that's not normal behavior. There's something going on here. So in that risk equation, what we have an opportunity to do is really lower the impact of an incident. In fact, I think Arctic Wolf coined this term of, you have an event, keeping an event from becoming an incident. That's a pretty hard part of that. So managed risk services is basically the vulnerability management and some various different other things, right? So there's the part about identifying the vulnerabilities and the part about fixing the vulnerabilities, and I think that's a huge piece of it. And the managed cloud monitoring. So this to me is fantastic to have this part bundled in together with all these other things, and being able to identify vulnerabilities that exist in the cloud environment as well, and misconfigurations and those kind of things. The other thing that we're doing is the incident response and the forensics, right? So we leverage the NIST framework, so it's very congruent with some of the things that we talked about earlier, but NIST 61 or 800, special publication 861, the second version of that, talks about incident handling, and they have a checklist and all these other things. But we're leveraging this framework to deliver incident response, including the forensics, which I think is phenomenal. And doing a tabletop, practice, right? We actually do a tabletop on the cyber incident response, which is cool, and remediate the vulnerabilities. So that's all I have on that slide. And we have 5 minutes left, so I want to be respectful of that. Let's see. This, I wanted to pull up this slide, and this is probably the last piece of content that we'll go through. I won't dig into the architectures and those kind of things, but I love this slide. And again, this is something that Arctic Wolf really engineered, was this active, proactive, and reactive mode of responding to an incident. And, you know, MDR, we've already talked about it. It's reactive, right? That assumes that somebody's compromised your network. And so early detection is critically important. The active part is basically, you know, is the SOC, right? Is having the people involved to do this every day. And the proactive part is managing the risk, right? And identifying the vulnerabilities and remediating the vulnerabilities. This is how you prevent bad things from happening. And by virtue of doing all these things, so I think it's worth mentioning that, you know, we'll act as the SIM in this environment, right? And collect and aggregate all of the log, all of the data that all of these security devices generate and all of those other things, and aggregate that, and not just review them or aggregate events, but real-time review log files and be able to identify indicators of compromise and trips and things like that. So I want to give you a chance to elaborate on this some, Brad, if you have it. Do you have any comments on this slide?
Yeah, I think you can kind of see it's building out a complete process, if you will, of identifying things on the active side, proactively being able to respond to and proactively harden your environments, and then being reactive, so ensuring we got containment activities and things like that. So yeah, it's a good slide to kind of talk through those different items. Oh, you might be on mute, Steve.
Yep. Okay. Sorry about that. So I want to, just in respect of time, just move through to, so I've got some additional content, and we're happy to send this to people, but we can talk about the architecture a little bit, and we can send this out, but it's really important. I want to wrap it up and just get to some of the questions that we have, Brad, so we can be respectful of that. But I want to mention this promotion that we're doing that is just, we're getting a phenomenal response to, and I encourage everybody to take advantage of this. But we'll give the audience a Yeti mug if you have a conversation about this, and there are so many different ways that we can help people. So I encourage you to take advantage of this, but just sign up for a 45-minute Zoom call and get a Yeti mug. And I have some of these Yeti mugs myself, actually, that and they're fantastic. So no question about that. So we're happy to do that. And I just wanted to mention that. I also want to mention, I said a couple of times earlier that we have a series about compliance going on, and third-party risk is a big part of not just CMC, but all compliance requirements and those kind of things. So coming up in 2 weeks, on June 3rd, we have another webinar on third-party risk. So I wanted to mention that as well. And because it's so closely related and coupled to this in a series, our vision is to go ahead and just register everybody, so you don't have to do that. And we're happy to do that as well. So I wanted to mention that. And just also, just from a resource standpoint, I just wanted to list some of the data that we have. You can get the CMMC, description, if you will, from that first link. Arctic Wolf has got some really good material on this, and so please go to their website and pull that up. And then we have some resources on the ASMGi website as well. So that said, we'll get to a couple of the questions, and I'll pull this up. So here's a question from an attendee: is the Arctic Wolf cloud log storage on FedRAMP high? So from a compliance standpoint, are you meeting federal regulations and complying with any certifications from that perspective?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think it might make sense to talk about this one a little bit more about the use case offline. But in general, Arctic Wolf sees network metadata, and we don't have access to documents that would be classified as CUI or FCI or things like that, which minimizes the requirements on our side. We did have a third party do a gap assessment. There has not been any formal audits that have happened. So we went through a gap assessment, and we expect to be at level 3 or higher if we were to ever go through a formalized audit. So that's kind of where we're at today. And just kind of reiterating, nobody's been audited yet. That the first C3 PAO was approved of by the DoD, and the CMMC accreditation body last week, I think is when it was, and they're not even publicly allowed to share that they're a C3 PAO yet.
Yep, awesome. Yep, great answer. Yeah, let me just. Okay, who does this apply to? We don't provide solutions to the government.
Yeah,
so I think we spoke about that a little bit, but go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's another really important one that I think is worth kind of reiterating a few times. If you do business with a company that does business with, and you're working on part of the contract for the federal government or for the defense, the Department of Defense, then you have these requirements. It's now a trickle down model.
Yeah.
So it trickles all the way down the supply chain. So you could be at the very bottom, but you're still in that supply chain. So you still have to meet that level of compliance.
Yeah, and we'll talk about this a little bit more on the third-party risk webinar, but just from a compliance perspective in general, one of the things that I talk about a lot is requirements are never going to go away, right? They're never going to get less stringent. They're only going to get more stringent. And this whole supply chain resiliency thing is incredibly relevant right now. Everybody's focused on it, and some of the the pipeline incident and just a lot of the really public incidents and data breaches and things like that have heightened the awareness of the importance of some level of resilience to attack and those kind of things. So I see more emphasis on compliance, not less, as part of our future. And I think it's important to understand that. The other thing that I would point out from a applicability standpoint is, again, like you said, it's not just the direct prime contractor, the person who's bidding on the contract that has to comply with this. It's the whole supply chain. But I also want to mention that this is a really good maturity model, in my opinion, right? The things that are in there, they make sense, right? So if we think about improving security posture in general, these things matter. And so I look at it as something that enterprises should try to do anyway, even the ones that don't do. It's different when it's a compliance requirement and when it isn't, right? So it's a lot easier to say nobody really cares about my data if you don't have to comply with something. But when it comes to I think the stat now is every 11 seconds, ransomware is projected in 2021 to happen worldwide every 11 seconds. That's like 7,400 and some odd incidents per day worldwide. It's phenomenal when you think about that number, right? People who don't put controls in place are absolutely going to be impacted by this. Absolutely, no question. So I think it's important to.
If there's one thing that I could leave everyone with, I know that there's a big question mark of when does this have to be done, and if you go to the Undersecretary of Defense website that was referenced previously, there's an FAQ, and it talks through. I don't remember off the top of my head the exact number of contracts that are getting it, but I think it's like 17 this year, and then it's going to slowly build up, and eventually every contract from the DoD, I think it's within 5 years of this year, will have this requirement. So there is some misconceptions of like, oh, I could be 5 years out. I wouldn't rest on that laurel, because when these audits are going to be done, one of the criteria that they look at for a control to meet the control is what's called institutionalization. And if you can look up the definitions around institutionalization, basically it needs to be standard operating procedure that's well known and well practiced. So I would urge people that might be still on the line to err on the side of caution implement this sooner rather than waiting later. That way, when it comes down to your actual audit date, you have that level of comfort there that, this has been in practice. We know it. We're not concerned that we're not going to pass it, because if you fail, that means you're no longer going to be a part of that contract.
That's right.
Thus, you're going to be losing money. So there's going to be some real world financial implications behind that.
Yep. 5 years goes really fast. I think that's the lesson that COVID has taught us too, this time warp that we're in, right? Another question, how do we know what level of compliance we need to meet?
Yeah, so broadly speaking, if you have access to FCI, federal contract information, level 1 is the requirement. If you have access to controlled unclassified information, level 3 is the requirement. It will be specified on the actual contract.
Yep.
So I would go to whoever is in front of you in the supply chain and ask them. And if they don't know, they need to go further up the supply chain until it gets to the correct answer.
Yep.
Because it will be on the contract.
Yep. And we are past the top of the hour. I'll get in one more question and then we'll have to call it. But the question is this: the overlap between NIST 800 171 and the CMMC. Do we have a gap, or do you have a gap assessment between NIST 800 171 and CMMC level 3?
Yeah, so you can essentially take all of the controls found within 800 171, and that's what level 3 is, along with, I think there's 4 or 5 additional controls that are CMMC specific.
Yep. So it's everything in NIST 800 171 plus a handful of controls.
Yep.
So there you have it. Thank you, Brad, so much for joining us today. And it's nice to have your expertise on our side. And I appreciate that, and all of your wisdom and contributions to the webinar today. And thanks. And if anybody in the audience has follow-up questions, please go ahead and submit them via email, and we'll work with you to get you answers and do all of those things. And I just want to thank everybody again for joining us, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Brad. Cheers.